I want to hear about like Joseph Smith and his revelation about the garment. And I know we don't have to go too deep into that, or we can go as deep as you want. I kind of want to hear like how they came about.
So Latter-day Saints draw a lot of their inspiration for the garment from the Old Testament, but it was ultimately revealed in a 19th century context. In 1842, in May of 1842, Joseph Smith instituted the endowment ceremony for the first time. He's in Nauvoo, Illinois, and he only has a small handful of people there. And at this point, the temple is not even built, which is where these ordinances and ceremonies are supposed to be performed. So he is hosting this ceremony in the upper story of the Red Brick store in Nauvoo, so a general store. And they kind of go up to the attic and they move stuff around. They put some partitions with curtains. They bring in some plant props. They bring in some paintings to just beautify the space. And that is the setting in which Joseph Smith institutes the endowment for the first time and inducts this handful of individuals into this sacred order. Now, part of receiving your endowment is receiving the initiatory, where you receive the garment. Now, because the initiatory process is more personal, like I mentioned, we are being clothed in the temple garment. Today, that process happens much more symbolically, and it is like a very modest experience. But in the 19th century, it was very immersive, and this was really trying to replicate this ancient priestly order. And so, because of that, being washed, being anointed, being clothed in the temple garment was a very personal and intimate experience. And so that wasn't something that happened in a group setting. And so the women and the men would all have this experience just one on one. You have the officiator and the person. And that's how it's done today as well, because it is a very private, personal, beautiful experience. And so Emma, Joseph's wife, would officiate for the women who were receiving their endowment, and Joseph for the men. And eventually, Joseph Smith delegated those responsibilities to other people as well as he inducted them. But we know very early on, the first endowments, receiving a temple garment was part of that experience. We don't know very much about it. The documentation is pretty limited because these are very sacred ordinances. In fact, the whole history of the temple is somewhat challenging to piece together because of its sacred nature. There's not tons of documentation that's publicly available. We don't want necessarily a lot of this information to be publicly available. So trying to piece together the history of how it all came to be is a challenge sometimes. But we do get the sense that this wasn't something that Joseph just like pulled out of thin air. Like I said, we clearly are drawing parallels from the Old Testament here, but we also get the sense that there was a revelatory aspect to it. We have some limited documentation indicating that Joseph Smith had like an angel tell him about the vestments that these people were supposed to wear. And he worked with Emma and the Relief Society to create these garments for the first time and to create the temple robes for the first time. And we do understand that he had editorial oversight over this and he wanted to make sure it was done right. So I don't have the source off the top of my head, so I don't want to like say something incorrect, but there is like one source that talks about how Emma had tried to construct the temple robes where the headpiece looked a little bit more like a crown, but Joseph kind of corrected her and said, no, it needs to look more like this. And it resembled more the priestly mitre. And so there is something to the idea that Joseph is receiving revelation. He had some sort of vision that this needed to be done right, and there's a specific way it needed to be done. And so I think that's pretty cool. Now, after the 1840s, we've seen a lot of changes in the temple garment. In the 1840s, when the garment was first instituted, modesty norms were very different in the 19th century. So the garment went down to your wrists, to your ankles, up to the collar, and it was white from the very first days of the garment. I don't know what textile it was. It was probably linen or cotton or something like that. Um, and it had a collar back then. And then over time, we've seen adjustments to the temple garment design. So the biggest one came first in the 1920s. The church leaders made quite a few adjustments to the entire temple experience. And as part of that, they made adjustments to the temple garment. Now, 1920s, again, fashion norms are very different by the 20s than they were in the 1900s or 1800s. And so they went from being down to your wrists to being short sleeves, and from your ankles to being down to your knees. And that basic shape has been pretty static for the last 100 years, which is crazy. I mean, it's a testament to the resiliency of the garment. In the 19 I think in the 1970s was when they introduced the two-piece. Before it was just like a one-piece undergarment, but then they made a top that you could put on like a shirt, and then bottoms you could put on as shorts. But they kept the same shape. And then, as many people know, in October of 2024, the church made a pretty significant change to the designs again, where they introduced an open sleeve design for people in hot and humid climates, which essentially resembles a tank top in a lot of ways. So instead of having the cap sleeve, it goes up to your shoulder. And then they also introduced a skirt or slip option for the first time, which is probably what I'm most excited about. So instead of being like boxer briefs on the bottom or biker shorts on the bottom, it's an open skirt. So that can open up new possibilities for people who want to wear underwear underneath, or whatever cultural norms exist in your part of the world. It just is more accommodating for that. So that is, 200, almost 200 years of garment history right there.
I don't want to